Right, so up next, we have our final session of the day, our keynote session, which is Log4Shell Testimony. Our speakers for this session are Brad Arin, SVP, Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cisco, and it will be moderated by Rohit Sethi, CEO at Security Compass. Rohit and Brad, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Raquel. So welcome, everybody. Appreciate you staying with us for the entire session here. I am pleased to be joined by Brad Arin, as Raquel mentioned, the Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cisco. Now, Brad, I don't know if it's just me, but I don't think I can see you, although I'm pretty sure I can hear you.
I'm here. Can you see me?
I cannot. There you go.
Yeah. How about now?
Awesome.
All right.
All right. Welcome. Well, thanks for joining, Brad. So maybe just to kick things off, tell us a little bit about yourself and help us understand your mandate as Chief Security and Trust Officer at Cisco.
Sure. So I guess the quick bio on me, I'm a career security nerd. So since I was 19 years old, I've been thinking about security. I started out more on the cryptography side of things, and I've evolved into software security. And now I think I'm just a generic security generalist. And I've been at Cisco a little more than 2 years now. And my role here as the Security and Trust Officer is I lead a group called the Security and Trust Organization, which I think makes a lot of sense. And the Security and Trust Org is composed of the teams that help us drive good outcomes when it comes to security for all the code that we're building for products that we ship to customers, the services that we own and operate, things like WebEx that customers use in order to visit the services that we're operating in order to drive value from the software we're building. And then also all the back office, IT security, back office systems, vendor risk management. And within my group, we also have a chief privacy office. And we also have a group called the trust office. And so we have to do the good work to make sure that we're delivering good outcomes when it comes to security and privacy considerations. But that's just the beginning, because in order for people to feel the trust, they need to hear about it and understand the details. And so the trust office is about driving that two-way conversation with external stakeholders. So customers, governments, regulators, other third-party ecosystem partners, and making sure they understand the good work we're doing. And if they have questions, that we're here to answer them. So that's what the trust office does. And so that's my job in a nutshell.
Awesome. So, we're here to talk about your experience with the Senate, where you spoke to Cisco's response for the Log4j or Log4Shell vulnerability. So tell us about that. What did they ask you to speak about, and what was the experience like?
Yeah, so I'll kind of give you the broad view first. So the Log4j security bug that was communicated publicly, I think is around December 9th or thereabouts. And this got everyone's attention. And a lot of people in the industry, including myself, felt like this was the big one. And we would see thousands of major breaches and hundreds of thousands, millions of nodes on the internet might be compromised as a result of this, because it seemed like it had all the hallmarks. It was a really easy bug to demonstrate that you had the ability to run commands on the vulnerable server, and it was integrated into just about anything written in Java. And so because it was so widespread, it generated an enormous amount of interest in people who were worried about it and trying to react and fix it. And so companies like Cisco had to scramble in order to make sure we understood all the code we were responsible for that integrated the vulnerable libraries, and that we could update and get these updates out to the people that are running that vulnerable code. And so companies like Cisco worked really hard, many other organizations did. And when the dust settled, even though it had generated so much attention, the number of compromises that were clearly connected back to this vulnerable piece of code turned out to be vastly less, orders of magnitude less than what I had anticipated. And so the good news is, if you're accused of overreacting, it's because bad things didn't happen. And so that's a problem I'll take every day. And what we ended up doing is, as an industry, there's a big freak out, there's a big scramble, lots of people worked really hard, a lot of weekends were ruined, a lot of nights, working late into the night. And then at the end of it, there was just a lot of people asking questions like, what happened? How can we do better next time? And we do postmortems internally at Cisco. I'm sure lots of other people do as well. And so it's not just people responsible for security that are interested in evaluating what did this incident teach us. And so there's a Senate committee, and I think the official name is Homeland Security and Government Affairs Senate Committee. And so this is the group responsible for oversight of DHS. And within DHS, you have CISA. And CISA is responsible for helping the US government respond to events like Log4j. And so the staffers that support the senators in this committee were talking to people in industry to understand, and these are folks, they're not computer scientists, they work in Senate staffers, they write policy. So they're really disconnected from the lives that we're living every day. And so they reach out to people in industry to say, like, what was that all about? We read the headlines, we don't really understand what had happened. How do we understand this? And so one of the groups they reached out to was Cisco, and a person on my team did a couple of meetings with these Senate staffers, and they were asking lots of questions. My team was giving them lots of feedback and trying to help them understand, because they were saying, the first questions they were asking are, like, is Log4j evidence that open source is broken and the government needs to step in? And my team is like, no, that is not what the Log4Shell event teaches us. But this is the starting point. And so we explained, here's what happened, here's what we did about it, here's the types of things that you can do to try to do better next time. And the Senate staffers were like, this is great, because you're coming from the real world, you're explaining a lot of details that we didn't understand before. And that conversation carried on, and then there's stuff that gets exchanged in writing. And then they said, we think this is sufficiently interesting that the chair of the committee wants to host a hearing on it. And this is like capital P politics. And so who gets invited, what kind of questions they ask, like everyone's got an agenda that they're pushing. And so Cisco was one of the organizations that got invited to attend. We did our research in the background, and we said, okay, we think this is a good event to show up for. And so when we got there, you submit a written statement in advance, which is like 10 or 15 pages long. And then you read into the record an opening statement, which is a shortened 5-minute version of that written statement. And then all the different senators, they get 7 minutes, and sometimes they'll spend 7 minutes just talking. Sometimes they'll use the 7 minutes to like ask a question. But if they spend a minute on a question and then you spend 6 minutes answering, their time is up. And so there's like a bunch of back and forth about how exactly that plays out. We did a lot of prep work in advance to make sure I wouldn't get blindsided by some question that I just stumble on. And the types of things we prepared in advance was to not only explain Cisco's experience, but what we think this means for the industry. And then we were also really anxious to make sure that nothing we said could be misinterpreted to imply that this is an open source problem, or closed source would have prevented this, or we should ban open source, or the government should regulate all open source, or things like that. And so we wanted to make sure people understood open source was not a problem. We also wanted to say nice things about the work that CISA did to help coordinate the response, and the JCDC and the information sharing that they helped coordinate. And so we were saying this part worked well, this part worked well. Here's some ideas on how to change things for the better. And this is not an open source problem. So these are kind of the key points I wanted to get across. And so we did it. There was lots of talking. I tweeted a bunch the next day, and then it was pretty much over. So just the highlights to basket afterwards.
Nice. I'd like to say those tweets went viral. I think they did. How do you get senators to understand concepts like open source security and software bill of materials?
So the truth is, you start with the Senate staffers, and the prep work that leads up to the actual hearing, it's all the staffers working together with the witnesses to help explain, this is where we're going, this is what I think my boss wants to hear, this is the points we're trying to make. And you've got me, my team that's helping me make sure I have all the information I need. At a company like Cisco, you have a government affairs team that's working back channel with the consultants and everyone else. And then we're talking with the staffers. And we're trying to explain, please don't go down this path. We don't think this is the right way to talk about it. And we think these are things that are exciting. And so we knew going in that certain senators were excited about software bill of materials. Other senators were maybe really excited about what's the China angle and what role did China have to play here? What should we do next time? Or should we be worried about China? And so that was really where they'd be coming from. And so each senator had some likely hot button topics. And the coaching and prep work that their staffers did with their boss to get the boss ready for the hearing was informed by the work we did to help the staffers make sure they understand the topics. And so when we show up for the actual hearing itself, the truth is it's not like a real world one-on-one conversation where like me and the senator are walking arm in arm down the hallway and I'm explaining the ins and outs of, SBOM intricacies. They're trying to get their sound bites in, they're trying to look good for the cameras. I'm trying not to screw up and I'm sweating the details to make sure I pronounce things correctly. And the key things that I was trying to drive for with all of my responses was focusing on making sure that people understood the real world work that goes into this and the idea that you can't just patch something the way you might on a home computer where you just hit update and then you're done. It's like a lot more complicated. You have change control, you have outage windows, you have to worry about rolling back if something goes wrong. And that in production environments with hundreds of thousands of servers, it's just a much more complicated thing. And at the same time, I wanted to make sure we get across the point that the value of people in industry working together so that if we understood, we see attacks targeting this type of installation, that's where we prioritize our response first before we move on to other things that we think are lower priority. And so for me, the key point was to really stay grounded, not get drawn into any overblown statements. And the work that, and there's a lot of people at Cisco that are involved with this, but working with the Senate staffers to get them prepared in advance, that was, I think, a big part of what's involved in actually getting the message through, for the senators that are there when we actually do the big pomp and circumstance.
That's a great behind the scenes look. I don't think many people have any idea, what that would be like. Just out of curiosity, any question that jumped out at you as the most interesting or entertaining or just stood out in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, I think one of the things, so it's interesting because you get surprises in both directions. So some questions were surprisingly savvy and these folks seemed to really get it and they were probing deeper than I was ready for. So I was like, wow, good for you. And then others were just off the wall and like, are we speaking the same language here? So one of the questions I thought was pretty savvy was one of this, I think this might've been Senator Padilla from California. And he was probing on the timelines and saying, what do we know about when this vulnerability is identified and when people started to target it with exploits? And so we have public data about when we saw the first exploits and things like that. And then the next question is, and how do you know there wasn't anything earlier? And you're like, well, we can kind of look back in the logs to see, because once you see something, you can go back and see when was the first time we saw an example of it. And he says, but how far back do the logs go? I'm like, well, that depends greatly. So a lot of places, the logs may only go back 4 hours. Other places might be 90 days or, some places log their stuff forever. But that's pretty rare. And then he was starting to ask questions around any answer I might give would be based on the logs that I have access to, but it's a really big internet and it's a complicated world. And the little tiny slice of what I can see from Cisco's vantage point may not reflect what else was happening in other parts of the internet, which is absolutely true. And so he was sort of pushing me in a direction where I would say, like, we have no idea, the world's burning, like we don't know what's going to happen. So that's kind of where he was going. And I was eager not to get pushed into that answer. And so for me, the big lesson is to say, look, the stuff isn't magic, it's all knowable. It's just a question of how do you instrument it appropriately in advance so that you can go back and ask questions after the fact. And then you have the right breadth and scope of what you're looking at to get those questions answered. So that's where we kind of kept the conversation, but the game within the game was, pushing towards somebody, whether it's me or another witness coughing up and saying, oh, we have no idea, we don't know what's happening.
It's funny. Yeah, I could see that happening. So, Cisco has had experience with something like SBOM, I'll say before it was cool. So what have you learned about, this concept of bill of materials and understanding?
Yeah, and I can tell you all about that. So basically, we at Cisco, and I just joined 2 years ago, so a lot of this happened before I got here, but Heartbleed, which we can all remember from way back, I think it's 2014, was a really big deal. And it really stretched Cisco when Heartbleed happened to get answers to where are we running this version of OpenSSL? What do we need to do to upgrade and fix? How do we get crisp information out to our customers who need answers now. And the truth is that Cisco did not perform well in the response to Heartbleed. And so there's a lot of lessons learned and a lot of soul searching. And they set really clear targets on what we need to do better in the future. And so getting insight into all the code that we're responsible for, all the components that exist within that code and what versions they are, and what are the current versions for those libraries became a key outcome that Cisco needed to get in advance to get ready for the next Heartbleed. And so you can think about that as like a software bill of materials. They didn't use that label for the work that was happening, but basically you have big ingest capabilities to go through all the code, and then basically big databases that keep track of all the components, versions, current version, recent versions, whatever. And so then when the actual Log4j event occurred, we, within a few hours, I don't know, 4 hours or something, we basically knew all the code that had the vulnerable versions of the library. And there's a few tweaks that we had to do to understand, is this the dead code path, or is this version of the product the thing we're shipping to customers? Because we had a lot more in our database than we actually showed customers. Some things were prototype products that aren't public yet. And so we had a list that we had to further scrub that we had within a few hours. And then we knew exactly what we needed to create updates for, do the right testing, get it out to customers, make sure customers can upgrade. So that process went pretty quickly. But just because we have a good inventory of all the components we're using, and we know where those components exist within each product that we're responsible for, that still is just a part of what the big SBOM vision is that's now kind of getting talked about, like with the executive order and what people in industry are discussing.
So, I mean, it's a good segue. You know, SBOM is becoming mainstream. Lots of people are talking about there's an executive order. You know, federal agencies are especially cognizant of it now. What are ways that this attention on SBOM might go the wrong way, might be misused?
Yeah, so one thing I'm really worried about, so that I think the dream, it's very fuzzy, but the dream is that all software has a really clear SBOM, which could be machine ingested by downstream consumers of that software. And so then if you're like a big bank and you have software from a million different vendors, the idea that you could hit a button the next time there's a Log4j or Heartbleed and just say, what are all the products I use that have this vulnerable component? And then you know who to go yell at. And you say, vendor X, give me an update for product Y. So that's the dream. The thing that I'm worried about, which seems almost inevitable that it's going to happen, is that the same team that does the vendor risk management questionnaires, and they send you an Excel spreadsheet with 1,500 rows saying, please fill this out. And you're like, it's in the SOC 2 report. They're like, nope, you got to fill out our questionnaire. So the idea that they're going to send us a like PDF that we have to like print out and write on and then scan and fax back to them or something. And it'll be questions about information that's revealed through the SBOM that they're misunderstanding or misinterpreting. And it's going to lead to a lot of back and forth. So that's one thing we're worried about. Another thing we're worried about is that if you think of the idea of a software supplier sharing an SBOM with the downstream consumer of that software, it's like shining a big flashlight in a dark corner where previously there was no insight, it was just a black box before. And so now that we've shown that flashlight into that dark corner, who knows what kind of spider webs and other things we're going to find. And so there's going to be a lot of stuff which might be orthogonal to the real security drivers of what's within that code base. But the customer might say, well, you know, like you're using this out-of-date version of some library. And we're like, yeah, but that's in a dead code path. We don't actually use that. And it's more trouble than it's worth to like refactor the code to get rid of it. So we just left it there. And they're like, but it's out of date. So you're going to need to go fix that. Okay, fine. So like then you go clean it up and then you have to go do other stuff. And so the amount of work that this will trigger is going to be vast. And if you think of the pie chart of how much of that work will be really useful in making things better, and what if it's just like busy work and pedantic and it's not actually driving changes in outcomes, I think there's gonna be a real spasm of this. If we work through that, the idea that eventually this is going to be a way for people that rely on software downstream to get better insight into what they're relying on, to ask sharper questions that will then drive better behavior by the people who are responsible for maintaining that software. It's compelling. There's going to be a lot of work to get there to achieve that and really take advantage of that potential. But I think that's what everyone's rooting for when they talk about the potential for SBOM.
So, I mean, you're in front of an audience of, product security leaders and cybersecurity leaders. What can we do to prevent this dystopian future?
Yeah, exactly.
The
So
compliance versus security kind of exercise.
yeah, and I think the real trick is when we start to see SBOMs published and downstream consumers of SBOMs are going to start to actually have something in their hands that they can look at, thinking about what's really the pragmatic changes we want to see. And then in the beginning, you may have a clever idea of how you think things should get better. In the beginning, I think if we all talk to each other and we start to come up with industry views of, you're going to have this big spectrum of activities that the SBOMs might motivate. And some of these may rise to the top as really compelling tasks that, yes, everyone should go do that. And then there may be things that should float to the bottom as pedantic, busy work that probably doesn't really make much of a difference. And if we can at least focus people on the most compelling tasks first, that's always my big thing. What is all the technical debt we're aware of? How do you sort and prioritize? Let's do the investments in the most compelling opportunities for improvement first. And if we can do it as an industry to understand this is what I think is really going to drive outcomes, figuring out ways to do like almost A/B testing or collecting data to say, we asked this vendor to do this, we asked vendor Y to do something else, and then which one drove better outcomes within your environment. That kind of thing I think would be really fun to track. And you start to get the chance for metrics and measurements of things that previously you couldn't track. And if we can use like evidence-based requests to the upstream providers, then I think that can help drive better outcomes. So that's the type of thing I think if we all just keep talking to each other. And one of the things I talk about internally a lot is like, don't turn your brain off. Be pragmatic, listen to the other side, and let's together try to struggle towards what is the best use of resources, given we're all over busy, we all have more things we could be doing. So how can we make sure we're focusing on activities that we think are genuinely going to drive the best outcomes?
Awesome. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's almost, there's almost like a invitation to the research community there to start to do some real testing and gather data about what's the most effective way to leverage SBOM data. So I really like that idea. Knowing what software a product is composed of is a great step in visibility. What comes next? What's the next logical step from your perspective in product security and pushing it forward?
Let's think about this. So I think there's some very basic fundamental questions which we don't have super crisp answers right now. And so these are things, if you got hired into a new company, you inherited a code base that might be historically indifferent to security. Where do you start? What are the activities that are going to drive the best improvements fastest? And if you were to survey a dozen different product security savvy folks, you might get 20 different answers as to where you should start. And each person will have their arguments and justification why they're right. I don't know that as an industry, there's a crystal clear set of things to do where you say, if you're going to start somewhere, start here, go here next, go do this. And the analogies I always draw is when it comes to like personal health and wellness. And so if you take someone who's had some bad habits, they haven't been focused on their health, and they go to a doctor or a trainer, or, some fitness guru, and they're like, I'm ready to start. And I think a lot of people would offer the same advice in roughly the same sequence. So like, let's start smoking, let's start losing weight, let's get some movement into your life. Let's make sure you're eating a well-rounded meal. You're getting all your fruits and vegetables and that kind of thing. And if you get these basics going, manage your stress, get plenty of sleep. Like, these are things that I think everyone can agree with in the health and wellness community. And what is the equivalent within the product security space? And some people might say things like static code analysis. I like threat modeling myself and data flow diagrams. And, so there's all these good ideas. And I don't know that we've reached that consistent received wisdom across the industry where everyone says, oh yeah, quit smoking, lose 100 pounds, get yourself into a good, healthy weight, get plenty of sleep, get your greens. These are things in the health and wellness side I think really are universally understood to be useful. I don't know that we're there yet on the product security side. And so getting to the point where if you're talking to some CIO or somebody who's a couple of notches up from product security, and you can just tell them, these are the obvious things you've got to get nailed before you start working on anything else, and then you can worry about the exotic stuff. That to me is the starting point. And then how can we as an industry best advertise when I'm responsible for a code base and I'm doing the basics right? How can I communicate that to stakeholders in a way that they can have confidence and trust? And when you look at things like SOC 2 and FedRAMP and all these different certifications, they're looking at more of operational activities in a hosted environment and not at the steps you take when you're producing software. And so figuring out what are the right steps, how do you codify that in some kind of third-party standard that you can then go get certified against, so then it'll mean something. And so then buyers can say, well, I'm not going to buy from you unless you adhere to this standard that I have trust in. So these are some of the things that I think would be nice next steps. And until we get there, we're stuck with white papers and people going to conferences and saying we're smart, we have our security development life cycle, but each team has pretty different interpretation of what they think the right steps are.
It's a really interesting, way of framing the problem that I'm not sure I've really thought of it explicitly like that. That's not clear for somebody coming in to go to one place and say, this is what you need to do. It's what everybody does. Certainly not what happens. It's almost like the analogy in reality for a lot of product companies, if you draw it back to the healthcare world, is like you start with the heart attack, and then you go backwards to like, maybe I should, maybe I should be having the right medicine, and then exercise, and then diet, and then vitamins, and you kind of work your way organically to something that's more holistic.
Yep.
Which is maybe not the way we would recommend to people, but there are a lot of frameworks out there for sure, and there's the BSIM, OpenSAM, et cetera. Recently, there's been a lot of attention from, again, you think back to federal government, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, has required federal agencies to comply with the NIST Secure Software Development Framework, or SSDF. Previously there's been some attempts at an ISO standard on this, and I don't know if it really caught all that much traction. But this is something that has, I guess, a little bit of regulatory backing, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Do you foresee vendors, looking to demonstrate compliance with something like the NIST SSDF? Does it matter that it's NIST versus perhaps a more proprietary standard or something along those lines? Or is it just like another thing, and we need something totally different from?
Yeah, and so I'm not deep on that particular standard, so I can't tell you my top 3 complaints about what they did wrong. But the idea that we would benefit as an industry. So the first question is, are we ready to codify in a standard format a set of activities and practices that we think consistently drive good outcomes? And if you go to the health analogy, if you eat right, get plenty of sleep, manage your stress, get lots of movement in your life, do the right amount of strength work, if you do all these things and then keep those habits for the rest of your life, chances are things are going to go well for you. And we can argue about what's the right amount of magnesium or the details, but the basics, if you nail those, things are going to go pretty well. If we're at the point as an industry where we think we know what those practices are when it comes to software development and integrating security into it so that you have those good habits that you just need to follow for the rest of the life of that code base, then the question is, how do we get the right authority behind that standard so that we can then start to integrate it in with procurement requirements and all of the ecosystem work, which will then make it a common practice across the whole industry. So NIST, I think, is a really good organization to help drive that, because they're going to be above the fray when it comes to some of these for-profit standards. And so I think if you had a for-profit entity promoting their version of the standard, the joke about SOC 2 is that it's a auditor employment act, because they want to make sure there's enough money, spent on auditors doing audits all over the place. And so if NIST comes out and says, this is our best effort in an apolitical fashion to come up with what do we genuinely think is going to drive good outcomes, and it's got the NIST stamp of approval on it, not only is that very meaningful within the federal procurement universe, I think it's also going to carry a lot of weight within the United States overall. And then a lot of other countries, whether they use it directly or they take inspiration from it to come up with their own, German version or French version or Australian version. I think a lot of people pay attention to what NIST is doing to decide, does it have merit? How would we tweak it for our environment? And how can we leverage their initial investment? And so we've already seen this, with NIST cybersecurity framework. This is something that a lot of boards will ask security leaders to say, how do we measure up against the NIST cybersecurity framework? So I think it's a good place to start. And then I'll have to go back and do my homework to see, do I love their current standard, revision, or, would I quibble with certain aspects of it? That's something I don't have today.
Yeah, and I didn't mean so much about the details of what's in this standard, but more about the idea that it's NIST and that it's, driven by, like you said, the same organization that has the cybersecurity framework that really is, like an international standard. So yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think that this is a little different than maybe some of the predecessors just because of the weight of NIST. So, kind of a little bit of a tangent now. We talked a fair bit about open source security. So there's been a lot of attention paid to open source security. But you find I'll say digital product vendors. So that's somebody who builds software or hardware or, like IoT devices, cars, you name it, right? But that they're software enabled. They have the same kinds of challenges with proprietary code. It's not just open source. That's to say those products are made of many components, some of which are built in-house by different teams, some of which are purchased by other suppliers, and some of which is open source. If you were talking to somebody who's new to product security and they wanted to just get a handle on like, how do I understand, or what do I do to get a holistic view of risk when I think about these things together, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I think one mistake people make is they think that the open source development model brings with it some universal characteristics, which are true across every open source project. And it's simply not true. So, there are open source projects out there which are like examples we should all dream to adhere to. And they're some of the best code and, tightest, most efficient, most elegant code that exists on Earth. And then there's a lot of garbage, and there's a full spectrum. And just because you do it in an open source model doesn't mean you're always going to get great outcomes. And so you can do an open source project and develop really crappy, terrible code. And you can also do open source, maybe even following some of the same rules, and get something that's really beautiful and your heart sings when you read that code base. And so I don't think that, people say like, oh, open source brings many eyeballs, and all bugs are shallow with that many eyeballs. And when you look at the Log4j example, it was open source. It's used everywhere. And yet almost everybody who relies on Log4j never ever once looked at it. They just import it, use it, it works, they don't bother with it. And so then you start to get into questions around what are the support models, how vibrant is the community, what's the velocity of feature change and code change, and then if problems occur, what are the real world SLAs that they tend to adhere to within that project? And the same way that you would judge a for-profit closed source software provider by the same metrics around how well can you support it, how quickly can you turn around fixes, what if it's an emergency, you can ask the same types of questions for open source projects, and you're going to get a really wide spectrum of answers. And so there may be one heroic lone volunteer maintainer who's supporting an open source project nights and weekends, and that's it. And they're great and they're doing the best they can, but that's not necessarily the project you want to bet your company on. And then there's other projects which are vastly better than anything you pay money for. And they've got incredibly vibrant community, really big teams, and they're probably doing better than pretty much any vendor on the earth could do in a closed source model. And so taking the time to evaluate what do you need from this code base, whether it's closed or open source, what are the kind of turnaround times, the feature velocity, the sort of support model that's going to make sense for you. And then you can get those questions answered by looking at it, whether it's closed source or open source. And there is no open source magic pixie dust that's going to guarantee you a certain outcome. You've got to do the legwork to evaluate whether this project is going to meet your needs for what you're doing today. And then whatever you think makes sense today, you're going to evolve too. And so like your little toy project today may grow into something much more important in the future. And so the idea that like annually or something, you refresh that. And you need to do so in a common sense way. I've seen all these examples where some big bank sends a questionnaire to like an open source project saying, if you don't answer these within 24 hours, we're going to terminate our use of your product. And they're like, it's open source, do what you want. Like, I don't care. Like, I'm not answering your stupid question. And so the idea that you need to understand the community you're working with. And most of the time, if it's a mature open source project, this stuff is all public and you can really get good answers and insights. But you got to do so in a way that's not tone deaf for who you're working with.
Right. Okay, sounds good. I have one little thing to add that's related to this topic, and then I'm going to go to questions. And so it's a bit of a shameless plug. We've recently started discussions with the Linux Foundation on extending the SPDX SBOM standard to include security and compliance controls information. So for example, you're using MongoDB. What controls do you inherit and what new controls do you need to implement? So how do we reduce the amount of work for developers and development teams because certain components handle security concerns for you? And so we've received some interest from several US federal and civilian agencies to participate in building an open repo of common software and infrastructure components and their security controls, leveraging likely NIST's OSCAL format. So this is still a concept. It's nothing official yet, but just kind of putting the call out there to people who are watching. If you're interested, please feel free to reach out to our Director of Research, Altaz Villani, or myself, if your organization may be interested in participating. We could talk about that separately. So
that's great. So let me do my plug too.
Sure,
So when I look at the SBOM ecosystem, there are a lot of nerd fights that are going to happen between now and when the dust settles, and we have like the standard way that everyone does it. And so SPDX is one competing solution. There may be other contenders. I'm going to stand back and let the fur fly, and we'll let everyone like fight it out. And there will emerge whether it's one or a small number of compelling ways to do what we're today labeling SBOM. Right. And so one of the things that we've been doing at Cisco is thinking about, we know there's competing implementation options, and we are not so smug that we think we know which one's going to win right now. And so we're trying to get ready to support potentially multiple, or potentially maybe not our favorite. And so we need to get ready for that. And so we're trying to figure out what is the tooling infrastructure that will best support us for this uncertain future that we're entering into. We're very confident that many buyers will demand something that looks like SBOM in some format. We just don't know all the details yet. So one of the things that we're working on is called GitBOM, so GITBOM. And GitBOM is meant to be complementary to SPDX or whatever other SBOM implementation you might choose. And it runs sidecar to your GitHub or your Git protocols in order to make sure that you're capturing all the right artifact information. So then we can do the right signatures and everything else, so we know what's happening. And so the GitBOM work is a open source project that we're a big contributor and participant in it, but there's other big companies and other individuals that are participating as well. So if that sounds fun and people want to get involved, same as the work that you're doing, that's something you can go, there's like a web page and everything, so you can go Google it and figure it out.
Awesome. That's a great initiative.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. All right, well, let's start taking questions. So we have the first one here, which is for you, and it says, are we still at risk of politicians looking negatively at open source and trying to discourage or ban it in the future, citing such incidents?
So the question is, are we at risk? Yes. So when we were preparing for the Senate testimony, we were worried a couple of weeks before the event that this was going to be a big open source bashing session. And the kind of things we were worried about were headlines: open source, unsafe to use, open source, bad idea, down with open source. And none of this could be further from the truth. And like we said earlier, you can do great things with open source. You can do terrible things. You can do great things with closed source, terrible things. I don't know that open source delivers anything consistently different or better than what you get with closed source. I think it's all about the creativity of the individuals involved and the model that they're using to follow the execution. And just because open source doesn't create pixie dust for the positive or for the negative. So that's my view. And the truth is, today, there is an enormous amount of value that comes from the open source community. And so any attempt to heavy-handed get involved and regulate out of existence, or say you can only buy the closed source edition of an open source module, these things are bad ideas. And so we worked alongside with the other witnesses that came forward to make sure that we had our talking points together. If the questions came up, they said, Mr. Arkin, wouldn't you agree open source is evil and the source of all our discomfort when it comes to cybersecurity? We say, absolutely not. And we give lots of examples about open source is just code. Code is written by people. All code written by people is going to have problems. And we need to be able to react to that. And so it doesn't matter open source, closed source. So this was really where we were trying to go with that. And the way you have all that prep work in the go-between, as we're getting ready, we're talking to the staffers, they're talking to their bosses, they're talking back to us. And so the concern that there'd be a lot of open source bashing, and we were getting ready to rear up on our hind legs to defend against that. And we were telling the staffers, this is not a productive path to go down. And so please tell your boss, like, don't demonize open source. And so the staffers got it. And so a lot of our prep work, maybe because of the prep work, so it ended up not becoming a bashing session. So, you know, potential averted in that one event. But the idea that somebody who naively, who doesn't have any experience in the software universe, and they'd say, like, if it's free, how can it be good? We should require only closed source for the federal government. Someone in some room will say that out loud. And we need people who understand the details to say, that's actually not the best way to drive the outcomes. And so I don't think this was the, you know, the last time that we'll hear that potential line of questioning. And so as an industry, we just have to be ready for it and be ready to give good answers.
Okay, fair enough. It doesn't look like we have more questions. I'll just double check with Raquel if anything else has come in from the audience.
No, that seems to be it. We do have a lot of people that love a lot of nerd fights are going to happen quote, but but that's all we have so far from the audience.
Awesome. Well, Brad, any parting thoughts or anything you want to say before we wrap up here?
It's been a fun conversation. I think one of the things we talked about earlier, particularly with this audience, we're all in this together. And I think the ecosystem that we represent has the potential to continue to drive this topic and ratchet it up better and better over time. And at every step, trying to be pragmatic, trying to create the swim lanes that encourage us to allocate resources on the tasks that are going to make things better fastest. And wherever we can, avoid the busy work, and also creating a feedback loop. So with best of intentions, we may create some rule or requirement, which we hear the feedback 6 months, a year later, it's not working. What you thought would happen isn't happening. This is a waste of time. Let's learn from that, be responsive to it. And this is something I'm always trying to do with my teams. And if we can all do that together, the idea that we can take our scarce, precious, finite resources and allocate them in ways that will make things better fastest, that's the most we can hope for. And the more we keep talking to each other, I think there's a chance for us to drive good outcomes more consistently, which is the real goal.
Absolutely. And look, this conference will always be a forum for that kind of conversation. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Brad.